started discussing about the forms, how to deal with the Angular forms, what are the types of forms. One basic example we learned. Yeah. So today we will see how do we deal with how we can work with the template driven forms, how we can use the template driven forms. So yesterday we discussed about the difference between template driven and model driven, which you will see practically now. How to configure the forms and work with the forms. One example we will see. What is a template driven form? Yesterday detailedly we discussed that template driven is all the configuration is defined at the view level. Manipulations, configuration, everything is handled at the view level, right? So how we can define this and how we can access and use this? One simple example we will see. So one simple example for handling it. Okay, let's create a small example for this. I will add a terminal. So we will open our app in the integrated terminal. Let's create one component. Yeah. So ng generate component template form skip test. Okay. I'm creating an example here, template form. Okay. Now, the first point here, let's keep this template form in the startup. Template form in the startup. In the index, let's keep that template form. Okay. Fine. Now I'm designing the template form in the UI. Everything is defined in the UI. The configurations, the specifications, everything is in the UI. So what we are doing is, so in the HTML, we are just creating a simple form, a container fluid, and we will keep a class as row and a div class as some call 3. And here we have div class as call 9. Okay. Now in this left column, I'm designing some form. So like a register product, I'll just give an register product. Let's add a div. So class as form group and label as name, and a div. So input type is equal to text, and class as form control. Okay. That is the group for name. I will add another group. So this is for some price. Okay, I will add another group. So this is for quantity. Okay, and another group. This is for shipped to, shipped to. And here I will define a drop down. So because user can select a city. So option, so we say Delhi, and option say Hyderabad. Okay, that is one option. So these are the basic options defined here. You can add any controls like check boxes, anything else you want, you can configure them. Right. So suppose I defined another form group, another form group. So say like in stock, in stock. So here input type checkbox, and that doesn't require any form control. And this is here, yes. Okay. Now this is also configured as form control. This is the form that we designed, and we will keep a button here. Class as form group, and we have a button. Just register button. So BTN and BTN primary. Fine, these are the options. Okay. Now our intention is this is all the form elements. So make sure that all these form groups are defined inside the form, inside the form. That means entire that register product and all these form options, all these form groups are defined inside a form. These are all the form elements actually. Fine. Let's run this and see the template form. Just design is ready actually. So let's run this and see, and the form is here. We have the form. So let's keep this button as BTN, BTN block. Okay. So this is the form we are having. Now, whatever the details entered inside these controls, so we need to collect the details and use them in our application. Earlier, in order to collect the details from the form and use the details, we have to use a two-way binding technique. So we need a reference and we need a value to store. And through the two-way binding technique, we can read the value, we can identify the changes in the value, update those changes. So we have used a two-way binding technique. And generally, if you remembered, in two-way binding technique, to store the data of name, price, quantity, for every purpose, actually, we need a reference in the controller. Controller means in this, we have to create a property for name. We have to create a property for price. It will store the data. Now in template driven approach, we will not do any configuration or any manipulation in the controller level. Everything is in the UI only. How you will manage that? First point is the form that you have designed. It should take hold of all these controls in order to identify the values from them. So, and in order to access the elements from a form, then form also should have a reference name, because there can be multiple forms in a page. Then there can be multiple forms in a page. In that case, every form needs a reference. How do we define a reference for the form? So we give the reference for the form by using hash and any name for the form, FRM register. That is the reference name for the form. So technically, you given a reference name for the form, but Angular is not identifying this as a form. It is not identifying it as a form reference. So that means it is just like a static attribute that you have defined. So that means your form is not still under the control of Angular. Angular is not taking control of your form. So that means you have just designed a form. You just designed a form, but Angular is not taking control over this. Then how Angular can take control over the form? So by using an ng form. So that means now ng form is applied. Ng form is it is actually so of type ng form. Yesterday I told you it provides all the properties. That means in simple terms, you can say that FRM register is implementing this ng form. That means now FRM register is a form type. It is a form type. How you can define a form as form type? Dynamically, a form is defined as form type by implementing ng form. So that means the form reference should be of form type. That is important point. Let's make the key points here. So what are the keynotes you need to understand here? Keynote, right? First point is, so a form reference. So technically, so a form reference, so must implement. So ng form must implement ng form. A form reference must implement ng form to handle the form behavior. A form reference must implement ng form to handle the form behavior. That is the first thing. Generally, for that we have to use a form and hash some FRM register is equal to ng form. So that ng form is actually ng form is of type ng form, uppercase ng form. It is of type ng form. That is the basic thing. So it is of type ng form, right? So actually the type is ng form. It references this FRM register. That means now form will have a form behavior and it can access all the form related attributes dynamically. So that means this ng form makes the form dynamic so that you can handle the form dynamically. That means this reference. So ng form makes the form dynamic. That is first one. Okay. And yesterday I told you ng form is a member of form module. Ng form is a member of forms module in Angular Forms library, Angular Forms library. So in order to use ng form, you need a forms module and you need to import it. Already we imported this because we learned two-way binding. In two-way binding, we already used this. So we already have a forms module. Otherwise it should show, it will show a message, ng form not available. So already we have that forms module. So forms module, we already imported that, and we are using forms module. In two-way binding, we done that. So if you are creating some new project and directly you are dealing with template driven forms, you have to make sure that the forms module is imported for you. That is important. So it is a member of forms module in Angular Forms library. You have to make sure that it is imported. Okay, now form becomes dynamic. Okay, second point is, so generally according to the basic rules of HTML, you know that form related keynotes, we know that. Another point is form cannot access and submit data of any control without a name. Without a name. Form cannot access and submit data of any control without a name. That means form controls requires name. That means every control defined in a form must have a name defined. Every control must have a name defined. That's very important. Every control defined in the form must have a name defined. It's mandatory because form cannot access and submit data of any control without name. So name is mandatory. Name is mandatory for the elements. So you make sure that the elements that you have inside the form and you want to use them, they have a name. For few elements, you haven't given name. For other elements, you give a name. Then it will use only the elements that have name. That is a general HTML logic, you know, actually. So for every element, we will make sure that it is defined with a name. So what I will do here, so for input name, I will give the name as txt name. Okay. And for this, I will give the name as txt price. Okay. And for this, I give the name as txt qty. And for this, I given the name as lst cities, lst shipped to, like this, shipped to. Okay. And here I given the name as opt stock. That is opt stock, that is option stock. Fine. That means all the controls whose values you want to collect, you have to make sure that they are defined with a name. That means the syntax is, so we have input, so type is equal to input type is equal to text and the name is equal to txt name. That's how we configure that. We have to make sure that they are defined with a specific name. They are defined with a specific name. Right. Okay. Now, next important point is, now form recognizes these elements. Form can access the elements. So, but Angular is unable to dynamically handle the values of these elements. Form can recognize the elements, but Angular also need to recognize these elements. That means another point you should know is, so Angular, you should know is Angular cannot cannot recognize, Angular cannot recognize any element dynamically, any form element, better, any form element dynamically. Angular cannot recognize any form element dynamically. So by default, it cannot recognize. It is important to configure the static form element into dynamic. That means you can simply say that the static form element must transform into dynamic form element. The static form element must transform into dynamic form element. For that, actually, so we have ng model. ng model is a directive that makes the static DOM element into dynamic. The static DOM element into dynamic. That means ng model will make the static DOM element into dynamic. Here you will better say as form element into dynamic. That means any element you want to handle it dynamically, Angular cannot handle that. For that, we need to use ng model. That means now you can see that. So you can see that here for every element inside the form, I am defining ng model. For every element in the form, I am defining ng model. So ng model is defined for every element. For every element ng model, then it becomes dynamic. That's good. So that means the static DOM element is converted into dynamic. Actually, ng model, it is of type model. It is of type ng model, right? So it becomes dynamic. So that is done. How we can make any element dynamic? So input type is equal to text and the name is equal to txt name. To make it dynamic, we have to say ng model. It becomes dynamic. But important is after making dynamic, it is dynamic, okay, good. But it should have a reference name in the dynamic memory. It should have a reference name in the dynamic memory so that its value can be stored in that memory and we can access the value. That means here, every dynamic element must have a reference name, So every dynamic element must have a reference name. So which is used as a model name to store its value dynamically. That means every dynamic element must have a reference name, which is used as a model name. So model name to store its value dynamically. That means these all controls became dynamic. That's good, but they don't have any reference name. You may say that already name is there. That is static name. So for form element in HTML, it is not dynamic name. That is just the static name. Static name is required to fulfill the functionality of a form because form cannot recognize, HTML form cannot recognize any element to submit its value if it is not having a name. That is a common thing, general thing. Now, Angular also requires a name in order to handle its value. So that means we need a static name and we need a dynamic name. Both names you can maintain same or you can use different. That means I will use a dynamic name. So as hash txt name. Okay, this dynamic name is referring to a form control. So if it is referring to a form control, if it is referring to a form control is defined. So it is of type ng model. Form is of type ng form and the form controls are of type ng model. That means here 2 points are there. Why you written ng model? To make it dynamic. Okay, good. After that, this will be implemented by txt name. It will be implemented by txt name and makes a dynamic name for this particular element, so that whatever the value you have entered into this text box, it will be now stored and accessed by Angular with this reference name, txt name. Remember, this name and the form name, the general name you given can be different. Which one Angular will use? Angular will use this ng model name. Which one HTML will use? HTML will use this name. This name. You need both of them. As per the rules of the form should have a name. As per the rules of dynamic form also should have a reference name. And that reference name is txt name. And form is of type this. So, and every element, here one more point is, so every form element must implement ng model, So that means every control, so every control is configured as, every control is configured as ng model, so that it can have a reference name dynamically. It can have a reference name dynamically. Every control is configured with ng model so that it can have a reference name dynamically. So that is important here. So how we can configure that? So we say input type is equal to text. Okay, name is txt name. This is for HTML. ng model, okay, it became dynamic, but dynamic should have a reference name, txt name, and is equal to, it is referring to model. It is of type model. So form is defined as ng form and form controls are defined as ng model. Form related properties are derived from ng form. Control related properties are derived from ng model. So final conclusion is this, that form related properties are derived from ng form. Control related properties are derived from ng model. That is the final summary. So if you are designing a form, it should use ng form. If you are designing a control, it should use ng model. So now how we can access the elements and use those elements? So now for every element, you have to configure the same. That means hash txt price is equal to ng model, and hash txt qty is equal to ng model, and hash txt lst shipped to is equal to ng model. Okay, and here hash opt stock is equal to ng model. all these are configured in this. These are configured in this. Okay, all our model related options are defined in this. Fine. Now our form is normal in appearance here. Now, how we can access the data from these controls and use these options? That means here another important point is, so how you can accessing the values of template form, values of template form. So there are two different points to understand here. How we can access the values from template form, So technically, how we can access the values from template form and use the values from the template form. Usually, to access the values from template form, so there are two techniques. So what are those two techniques? Number one is you can use value property of ng form, value property of ng form. You can use value property of ng form. What is this property actually is? So the value property returns an object. It returns an object that contains collection of key value pairs. The value property returns an object that contains collection of key value pairs. From form key value pairs. Actually, what are these key value pairs? The key value pairs refer to control name and the control value, the control name and control value. That means you can use value property of ng form. You can use the value property of ng form. This value property returns an object that contains collection of key value pairs. The key value pairs refers to control name and control value. That means you can simply say that all form controls and their values can be accessed by using form name dot value property. We can access by using the form name dot value property. That means here syntactically we can define in this way, like hash. So that is we have FRM register dot value. What is this FRM register dot value? This is nothing but FRM register dot value. It returns collection of all form elements and their values. Collection of all form elements and their values as an object. That is the important. It returns the collection of all form elements and their values as an object. That means this one value property can return all of them. If you want to access any specific element related properties, this is for accessing So this is for accessing all values, all values. It is for accessing all values. There is another technique. This is for accessing all the values. There is another technique actually. So the technique is accessing any specific value, accessing any specific value. If you want to access any specific control value, then what you can do is, so in order to access any specific value, what you can do is, so you can access the value of any control by using value property of ng model, by using the value property of ng model. That means syntactically you can define like this: txt name dot value, syntactically txt name dot value. This txt name dot value, it returns the value of any specific element, returns the value of any specific element. That is what actually it can do. It can return the value of any specific element. I will show you that here. Simple. That means we have two options now: accessing all values by using form value property, accessing specific value by using control value property. So see here, in the design, I want to access all the control related properties and display. Then in the column right side, I will keep a simple heading. So form, or I will simply say product details, or I will simply put product object. And see what I am doing here. I will put a pre-tag. In the pre-tag, I will just use the form name FRM register dot, I will give some value, FRM register dot value, and I will convert this in a JSON form. That means it's an object. I will convert into a JSON form. So JavaScript, JSON is a filter which will convert into a JSON format. So technically, so FRM register refers to our form, and this value property, what it does, as I said, the form value property returns an object that contains collection of keys and values, and keys and values are nothing but control name and their values. And you can see in the design, you can see all control names came here. All control names came here, and the values are empty currently. And observe carefully. Here I entered some name, and that will be here. Here I entered some price, it will be here. Here I am entering some quantity. Here I am entering some shipped to. Here I am selecting in stock. All the details will be here. We are not writing anything logically, we are not writing anything in the controller. That means there is no code in the controller. You configured the control. Generally, you configured the control in the view. We collected the data from the control in the view. We maintained a cache memory for that view. In the cache memory, we allocated references for them. And in those references, we stored the values, and we are accessing and using those values. That means this is going to collect an object. As I said, it returns a collection of all form elements and their values. as an object. So register.value is returning an object that contains all the keys and value references. We can individually access them. Suppose for this, I said call as suppose 4. Okay. And I am keeping another div. So that is the class as call suppose 5. Okay, here I'm defining, so product details. So I'm creating another column, product details. I'm adding one more column, product details. I want to display that here. So the intention of this product details, so we need to add one more and display that product details here. So here I want all the details of the products, whatever the details they are entering, I want to display that here. Then what I will do now, I want to access individually. I will use a data list with a data term name. I'm using data definition, and here I want the name. Similarly, data term as price, another data definition. Data term as some quantity and the data definition. And I want some manipulation, data term as total and data definition. And the data term as suppose ship to, and data definition, and the data term as in stock, stock status, and the data definition here. Now I want to access the values of the elements individually. There is a lengthy technique actually, lengthy technique. Lengthy technique is nothing but we can act like this and display here FRM registered. Okay, in that we have txt name. Okay, in that, so sorry, FRM register have a value. Value is an object. In that object we have txt name. That txt name value we are accessing. That means it is that particular value we are configuring here. The text we are defining that. That means FRM register dot value is an object, form object. In the form object, there is a property called txt name. The txt name have a value property. Actually, txt name is just a property. Txt name is just a property. I'm just defining that property there. And you can see here, when I'm typing here something, so some TV, it will get that and display it. You don't need value because you are referring to that particular property. And if you refer the property, it will return that value. This is one way through a complete hierarchy. Suppose I'm accessing price. When I'm accessing price, directly txt price. This txt price is actually, so suppose I enter TV, that's working fine. TXT price is not displayed. You can see here it is displayed, but this is an object because when you are individually dealing, TXT price is an object which contains a value property. Through that value property, you can access its value. That means TXT price dot value. It will get that price value and display that price value there. That means here I entered TV. And here I entered price. Now it will be okay. It will display that. I entered quantity. So we have to get the quantity and display that value, right? Yeah, so see, this is not generally binding. It is just interpolation, right? It is not binding, just interpolation, right? We are not binding, just we are calling and interpolating. If you are defining to any property or any attribute of an element, then it is binding. When you call as a binding, generally, when you call as a binding, that means here this is interpolation. We are using as a literal, right? Suppose if I am defining like inner HTML, this is binding, am I right? This is binding. We are not binding. We are just interpolating that value. populating that value and displaying that value. I hope you understood that, right? So technically, this is here, we can handle expression. That means what we can do is here, so txt quantity dot value, and the total, we will define an expression here, txt quantity dot value into txt price dot value. So we are configuring that. Similarly, shipper to, we are writing an expression here. That means here, so LST shipper to dot value. LST shipper to value is returning a boolean. Then I will use a boolean expression. So that means if this value is equal to true, then we will put a question mark. We will say available, and colon, and we will put, say, that out of stock, that we are configuring. Similarly, stocks, shipper to is directly the city name. This actually, I have to write for stock, in stock, not for shipper to. I will just keep this as in stock, right? In stock. OPT stock, right? OPT stock dot value. This is for the next one. For stock, we need that condition. Shipper to is directly city name. So we can directly define that here. Shipper to is directly city name. We can directly get that and display here. That means we just use a shipper to, LST shipper to dot value. It is getting directly the value and use it. For stock, we have to get, is it true or false? We need to get. Okay. Now you can see that is how we design. And we are configuring the data here. So we entered some name, we entered some price, we entered some quantity, and you can see the total. And we selected some shipper to, and we selected in stock, yes, then available. So this is all the manipulation that we are doing on the form. And important is, so nothing done here in the controller level. You see, in the controller level, nothing. Not even a single reference is there in the controller to handle our data manipulations, everything at the form level. But finally, if I have to send that data to any server-side technology, so and handle the data through that other components also, in that case, obviously what we have to do is we need to collect the final data here and pass that to a service. That we have to do. So generally, how we can manage that part we can write here. But you don't need a controller if you want to handle all the operations in the view level. Without the controller, everything can be managed at view level. There is no single reference for that here. Everything is working fine. Right? Earlier, we need to do a lot of references. Here, everything is working fine. So only one point is, if necessary, then what we do, we collect the data from the form and send it to the services in the backend. That means, for example, source public I created on form submit. Okay, on form submit, I want to collect all the data from the form. On form submit, we need to collect the data from the form. Usually on the form submit, if you want to collect the data from the form, then how we can access the data from the form, how we can use the data from the form. So that is one point. That means when the form is submitted, that means the form control can use a submit event. The form control can use a submit event. When form is submitted, that means you can write submit. You can write submit event. Or Angular provides a special event called ng submit for form submitting. You can use this ng submit for submitting the form, or you can simply use the HTML submit event. And this submit event should call on form submit. And when form is submitted, entire form values, all the form values must be sent into this. All the control related values must be sent into this method. Then how to collect all the values and send them in one go? Just we can use here frm register.value. That's it. frm register.value is an object which contains the collection of all the form elements and their values, which you are sending into that method. And you see this method is collecting an object. This object contains the product related details. That means all the form data. And you know the properties now. So what are the properties? You can write a logic, or individually, I want to print some details. How we can access all the properties and print them, or how you can just access individual here. I will just put an alert temporarily. Actually here what we do, we get the data, send the data to any server side technology, or I will just create here. I will just create here a property called, sorry. So we will create a property called product. So this is a product, and this dot product, we will attach that object into that. That means product contains all the object details. That means that key and value is present here. Then I will just put an alert. In the alert, I will just say, so this dot product dot txt name, it should get the name of that particular product. On submit, it should get the name. Temporarily, I'm using this alert. We can generally handle this in a different way. We can collect the data from the form, we can send it to any service. That service will send to our backend technology. That means we are just collecting the data from the form and sending to the server side technology. We are not having any configurations at any level here in this situation. That means technically now everything is managed. Everything is managed by using this. So now you can observe that. So let's run this and see. So currently I'm collecting only name, right? So you can run this and see. I entered some product name and I defined some Samsung TV. Okay, that name. And after that, I just clicked on register. On register, it should submit the details and display the detail here. We are able to collect the data. So that means it's not necessary every time, but generally we need that. Why? Because so once you configure the form and all the data is defined for the form, finally we need to collect the data and we need to send the data. We need to collect the data and send the data to any services. For that we need this form object, and that form object is value. It allows you to collect, and here in the component we are collecting that object. We are sending that by using frm register.value. Collecting every value individually from the form is a difficult task. So we can simply use one object that can refer to all of them and access them. So that's what we are defining, right? Technically, so what is the main advantage and drawback for this type of approach? If you are designing, so inline documentation technique, already I told you in inline documentation, everything is present in one file. So in that case, then you can design that such template driven forms so that all the configuration will happen in the UI itself. So very less interactions are managed in the controller level. Now, another point is this is also having some drawbacks because testing becomes hard because there is no separation. It's not loosely coupled, tightly coupled. Extensibility issues will come. Later, suppose I want to add one more control. According to the situation, some controls should be hidden. Some controls must be added. So I need to change the form behavior as per the situation. Then it is difficult to handle with the template driven form. It's not impossible, but difficult. This becomes complex, very complex for template driven forms. And if you are doing lot of interactions at the form level, then usually means at the UI level, usually it will take more time for rendering, more time for responding, because it becomes heavy on the page, because all interactions are managed at the UI level itself. That is what actually the point about this template driven form, right? So how we can handle the validations in the template driven form, we will see that. So technically, so the example I just showed you, in this example, we have only two options. One is template form, template form dot component dot ts. In this, we just added, so this logic here, that is the logic inside this. And the majority of everything is managed. Majority of everything is managed in the HTML. This is also not required. This is just to show you how we can later handle that when we are dealing with any services to send the data from the form actually. So now we have another option. So template form dot component dot html, and here we are defining everything. We are configuring everything. So, and this is very complex. So a lot of things are there inside this. And this is the entire code for that. This is the entire code for that. That means we configured the form, we defined the form, and in the UI, and we are managing the form. Now, important here is when you are configuring, working with template driven forms. Now, another major concept you need to know is, so validation in template driven forms. Template driven validation in template driven forms means how you will handle the validations. Actually, the general point, if anyone asks what is validation, actually validation is the process of verifying user input. It is the process of verifying user input. And why you need validation? Actually, validation is required to ensure that contradictory and contradictory and unauthorized values are not stored, and unauthorized values are not contradictory and unauthorized data or values, anything. So validation is required to make sure that contradictory and unauthorized data is not stored into the data source, into the database, or you can say data source, into the data source. That means we have to make sure that contradictory means the type that you are expecting and the type that user input are not matching. So you asked for a string and user inputs a number, that is contradictory and contradictory data, right? And you said only 6 characters, he sent 20 characters, that is unauthorized. So that means the point is the limits are not crossing the limits or not according to the type, then we need to restrict them. Actually, Angular can handle validations client side. So Angular can handle validations client side. Angular can handle validations client side. They can handle validations client side by using a set of validation services. So these validation services, so Angular validation services are categorized into categorized into two groups. We have two types of Angular validation services. One is form state validation services. Form state validation services. And we have input state validation services. So technically, form state validation services, input state validation services, we have two predefined services are there. Actually, what are the form state validation services and what are the input state validation services? We will see that. Actually, so form state validation services are nothing but they are used for verifying all fields in the form simultaneously at the same time. That means so these are form state validation services verifies all fields in the form simultaneously at the same time. That means Angular verifies all fields in the form before submitting. It verifies all fields in the form before submitting and report errors and report errors. Actually, error report Boolean value. So what are those properties? That is form state validation services. And what are the various form state validation services and how do we use these form state validation services? Let's see. They very simple. Generally, one simple point how you configure them and form state validation service. We need to first know what are those services available actually. Technically, the Angular validation services for form state, we have some important services. So what are the form state validation services we are having? So let's see. So we have service name and we have property and description. Usually the form state validation services that we usually have here is what is the purpose of them? We will see. We have the service called ng pristine and its property is pristine. Actually, pristine is nothing but, so the pristine, what does pristine means? It returns Boolean true when form is untouched actually. That means it returns Boolean true when form is untouched. What do you mean by untouched actually? Form is untouched means, so you opened the form, but no modification happened in the form. That means no field in the form is modified. Just you opened the form and it is never modified. No modifications happened in the form. So that means no modification happened in the form. So that is what actually pristine means. That means it returns Boolean true. It returns Boolean true. So when form is untouched, it returns Boolean true when form is untouched. Form is untouched means, so what is the meaning of that actually? That means what is form untouched means actually. So the form is untouched. Its meaning is nothing but, it means that, so form never modified. That means form never undergone any modification. That means all fields loaded, but no modification identified. No modification identified. That means form is loaded, all fields are loaded, but no modification identified. Nothing happened, just opened the form. then we call this as pristine. We call this as pristine. We have ng dirty. Ng dirty, its property is dirty. Dirty is nothing but it returns boolean true, boolean true. It returns boolean true. And when it will return boolean true, it returns boolean true when form is modified. When form is modified. That means at least one field in the form. So in the form under modified, at least one field in the form modified, then entire form is recognized as dirty. Entire form is recognized as dirty. At least one field in the form modified, then entire form is recognized as dirty. That means form undergone the modification. So remember, this is related to all fields. These are related to all fields. And we have ng invalid and valid, ng valid. So its property is valid. What is valid? It returns true. It returns true when all fields for fields in the form. So in the form, all fields in the form are in valid state. It returns true when all fields in the form are in valid state. If any one field is invalid, then it returns ng invalid. Ng invalid. This is invalid. So it returns true when any one field, any one form field is form field state is recognized as invalid. It returns true when any one form field state is recognized as invalid. That means at least one field is invalid, then it is invalid. Entire form is invalid. I will show you the implementation, how this happens. We have ng submitted. This is done with submitted. And submitted is the property, and it is nothing but it returns true. On form submit event, on form submit. That means when form is submitted, so you can submit the form through any medium. When the form submit event occurred, it will return true. That means it is submitted. These are all actually the form related properties. And remember, all these will return Boolean, true or false. So all Angular services. So here all Angular validation services return Boolean value. So that is true or false. They will return the Boolean value. All validation services return Boolean value. That is what actually the point. And very important, how these properties are accessed. Syntactically, the form state services are accessed in this way. That means form name dot property name. That means we need to define FRM register dot. So suppose I say invalid like this. FRM register dot pristine like this. We need to handle in this way. We will see one example. Just a basic level example is enough to understand that form validation. And we will put in one complete example with combination of both. How to handle the form state and input state validation with a combination of both of them. Technically, I will just show you one example here. If you want to understand all these services, you can put them. Just for our understanding sake, we can put all of them in one example and we can test them. But reasonably how to use them, we will see another example. Suppose ng generate component, that is a template validation or form validation. Okay. and skip test. So I'm just creating form validation. One component I'm generating here. And let's see, because we don't need to write much logic for this. And here I will make this form validation component. So we are defining the form validation component as the startup. Okay, form validation. We are defining the form validation component. Okay. Now I will show you the differences actually, means all the properties we will first identify. So to understand what is meant by pristine and all, I will show you one simple one. Div class as some container fluid, and a div class as row, and div so class as call3. Okay, and here we have div and class as so call sum9. Just here I will create a temporarily data list with the data term, and here we name as data definition. First we need to make sure that everything inside the form, we will keep it simple, and directly hash FRM register is equal to ng form. We are configuring it as a form, and here we have input type is equal to text, and it should have a name. Okay, txt name. Okay, and it should have a model, ng model, and it should have a reference, txt name is equal to ng model, and it is having a validation called required. So this is a general HTML validation. Required is an HTML validation. Okay, that is required HTML validation. It can have more validations like min length. So min length is equal to some 4, minimum 4 characters are required. 2 validations are there. These are all HTML. Now, similarly, I have another term. So that is I defined as some mobile, and the data definition. Here we have input type is equal to text, and here name is equal to txt mobile, and this also ng model, and here we defined hash txt mobile is also ng model, and this mobile is having a pattern. Of course, this also can have required. Okay, and a pattern is equal to /+91 and 0-9 and 10 digits number, something like this. We return some pattern. These are all HTML validation. Now we have a form, and we have the form controls. 2 controls are there. We want to understand the form state here. So form validation services, form state services. Let's keep a table. So with the class as a table hover, so and table. Yeah. So we are just creating a table and table hover, and just t-head and tr and th. I'll just give the name. This is service. So service name, and here the value. So value, service name and value. I'll just give a simple service name and value just for our understanding thing. That means configuration, how the options are defined. We can create a tabular form, right? Just service name and value, one table form I am defining. In this, we have T body. In that, we have a row in that first cell. So pristine. Here, I want to display that pristine value. So that means here we need to access the form name, FRM register dot pristine. That is the property which returns its pristine value. Similarly, we have another row. So this is dirty. That is dirty. So, and here we defined as FRM register dot dirty. Later we will put in one example properly or working with that, right? This is to understand what are those services actually. Invalid. So, and the data definition. So FRM register dot invalid. Okay. And another option is data here valid. And here, so FRM register valid, FRM register valid. So valid. We are configuring in this way. Now one more option is submitted. So another row, it is submitted. Submitted. We want to get the value and see whether it is submitted or not. FRM register dot submitted. Okay, and you can see all the values in the design. You can see. Observe carefully. So currently, pristine is true. Pristine is true. That means no field have been modified because you just opened them. You just opened the form. You never went there. You never done any modification in them. Dirty is false. Of course, there is no modification happened, then dirty is false. Invalid is true. Why it is invalid? True because required is not satisfied for name and mobile. That doesn't invalid is true. Valid is false. Of course, valid is false. It's not valid. Submitted false because it's not submitted. So we don't have any submit button. Let's keep a submit button here. So that means just here, I will keep a button. So submit. So form have a submit button class as BTN. So BTN, so some primary. Okay. So we have a submit button. So that is the submit button we are having here. Okay. That means controls and other options we can configure. That is not the point here. So the point, observe carefully. Pristine is true. That means it's not modified. Okay, let's do some modification. I will enter some name as some Alan, ALA. And you see now immediately pristine is false. Why pristine is false? Because dirty is true now, because you have done some modification in the form. Remember, any field modified, it is true, not only name. For example, I will refresh this. Currently, when opened, pristine is true. That means no modification happened. Dirty is false. I entered into the mobile and started typing something inside it. Then you can see that dirty is true and pristine is false. That means any one field modified, then it is dirty. That is what actually pristine and dirty. Invalid is true. For example, see, I entered name John. So this is minimum 4 characters. It is satisfying, but still invalid is true. Valid is false. Why invalid is true? Because mobile is not entered. I will enter mobile number. Still invalid is true because it is not satisfying the pattern. Then I will put the pattern here. According to the pattern, it should be +91. Then valid is true. Invalid is false. Valid is true. That means all fields must return valid. Then only it is valid. And see, submitted is false because we haven't yet clicked submitted. When I click submit, then submitted is identified. Then it will say submitted is true. Submitted is true. So this is just an example to understand what is the purpose of these properties actually. Now our real world requirements will come. Like suppose I don't want submit button to work until or unless entire form is valid. That is very regular requirement. That means until or unless entire form is valid, BTN block. Okay. Until or unless entire form is valid, I don't want the submit button to work. I don't want this button to work. Currently this button is working. I don't want this button to work. Then how you will do that? It's very simple now. What we can do is for button, we have a disabled property. We will apply disabled property. Disabled requires a Boolean value, true or false. What is the condition? Condition comes from our form validation. What is the condition? If form register, FRM register is invalid, then disable. That's good. That means until the form is valid, this disable will not be false. This is a Boolean value and we are passing that Boolean value here. In that case, now you can see that you can see that submit button is not working. You can see not working. Now, of course, if it is not working, we can give a different style. Means if any button is disabled, then we can give a different style. Usually in CSS, what we do is, so for button, if it is disabled, so disabled, then cursor we will keep as not allowed. Not allowed cursor should come. That will be better. And you can see when it is disabled, and when I move the mouse pointer onto it, then it will show not available cursor here, not allowed cursor here. Now submit button is not working. I am unable to submit the form until I have valid. That means name entered correctly and mobile also entered correctly. Then submit button works. Suppose I have removed one character from the name. Submit button is not working in it. Why? Because it is invalid. Name is invalid. So I entered it valid. It is valid. Suppose mobile number is not valid, then again it is not working. Mobile number is valid, then it is working. Means all the validations should pass. So form state validation is to handle these kind of scenarios. You may ask, like, why do I need pristine? Why do I need dirty? I will show you different situations. We will understand about that. That means why do I know whether the form modified or not? When do I know the form modified or not? You have to know whether form modified or not. Generally, if you want to enable the buttons like save. Suppose you opened a profile page. In the profile page, your existing details are there. You can edit them. If you are not doing any editing, then save button should not work. Save button should work only when you've done some modification inside the form. Then how do we know form modified or not? So that I can enable or disable the button. We can do that by using this dirty and pristine like options. So these are all very important at the form state. This is example just to understand the various form state services. How to use them in a proper example, we will see that. Now, similarly, we need to understand input state services and working with them. That we will see in tomorrow's session, right? Tomorrow, we will see one complete example working with validations. And these are validations using template forms, how we can deal with them, right? Tomorrow we'll continue.